The attempt on my life has left me scarred and deformed. But I assure you, my resolve has never been stronger. In order to ensure the security and continuing stability, the Republic will be reorganized into the first Galactic Empire for a safe and secure society.
Hey there, welcome to the Lord to Death podcast. My name's Brett, and today I want to talk about Star Wars and what it might have been like to live in a galaxy far, far away under the reign of the Galactic Empire. This is something that I am very excited to talk about because if you know me, I live and breathe Star Wars. Ever since I was a kid, I hoped and prayed that I would get sold into slavery and live long enough to have a smelly old man come and whisk me away on his starship to Coruscant to join the Jedi and save the universe from danger. Okay, maybe we can skip the life of poverty on a desert planet and skip to being a space wizard, but you know what I mean. I would even settle for simply living in a universe where interstellar travel and alliances with alien races were established as an average citizen. So what would it have been like after the height of the Jedi and during the rise of the Sith? That's what we're here to find out, and I think the best place to start is the beginning of the Empire and the end of the Republic after the Clone Wars. Without going into the entire backstory of the Empire, because there really is a lot to unfold there, the Empire was born out of a Sith conspiracy to destroy the Jedi, with Senator Palpatine's true identity being Darth Sidious. He established an anti-Jedi stance after his attempted arrest by Jedi Masters Mace Windu, Kit Fisto, and those other two that no one ever remembers, by going to the Senate floor and stating that the Jedi wrongfully attacked him in front of the Senate. This paved the way to public distrust for the Jedi, allowing for bounties to be placed on their heads and garnering support for the apprehension of Jedi. And the reason that's really important is because the Jedi were really the only force for good and quote-unquote equality in the universe. Master Yoda taught that the Force flows through all things equally, and so therefore everything should be loved equally. The Jedi really tried to preach this, but how much they put it into practice is really up for debate. So after Order 66 with the Jedi out of the picture, there was really no force for good and equality. Not that the Jedi were the best, but they did try in certain instances. As a result, non-humans were typically forced into the Outer Rim because of rampant xenophobia that was led on by the Empire. And if you're not familiar with the core worlds, the mid-rim, and the outer rim, you can really think of it from upper class to lower class. The further outside the core worlds that you get, generally the more impoverished it is. There are rich and poor on all sides of it, but as a general rule of thumb, that is how it works. And that's because the further and further you get towards the Outer Rim, the less surveillance there is from the Republic, the Empire, and really any governing force in the galaxy. So basically, crime and piracy runs rampant out in the Outer Rim, and even in the Mid-Rim to an extent. The Imperial propaganda machine was so strong that even near-human species like the Chiss or Twi'lek ended up developing an inherent distrust for a non-human population. This means that the core worlds were more or less human-dominated, and you were actively rewarded for just being a human with more rights and a better social standing. And while there were no rules within the Imperial forces that said you have to be human in order to enlist, their forces were largely human because they were the source of all the hatred. After all, how often did you see a stormtrooper outfit made for an Ithorian? With all that being said, there were still some non-humans within the Empire. They would have a harder time climbing through the ranks, but they were still there as a minority. I think it's interesting to note that many of the non-humans that we see within the Imperial ranks work either for or alongside Darth Vader, as we see many of his Inquisitors and bounty hunters were non-human. To add on to the rampant xenophobia, non-humans were often used as slaves, like we see in Jedi Fallen Order on Kashyyyk with the Wookiees, and some were even the subject of genocide like the Geonosians, among others. In fact, there were several genocides committed under the Empire, and most of them were non-human. So how did aliens get on in the universe with their exclusion from the core worlds? Well, you really had three options. You were basically forced into slavery, crime, or rebellion. But even within the rebellion, there was blatant distrust for their kind. You have Leia in Episode 4 calling Chewbacca a walking carpet during her rescue from the Death Star, and even the famous rebel leader Saw Gerrera looked down upon the Geonosians, calling them bugs and treating them like they were only an obstacle to be crushed underfoot. Nonetheless, there was still a large alien presence within the rebellion who was still more tolerable than the Empire. And not to say that every non-human ended up being a criminal, but that was typically the trajectory. There was definitely a large population of non-humans that got on, led a normal life in the mid and outer rim, but typically you move to places where there are a lot of crime, and you're bound to end up in it yourself. So if you were a non-human, your outlook on the Empire was almost certainly a negative one. Not that things were perfect during the Republic, but if you were alive during the Republic era and into the Empire, you probably had your entire life uprooted. If you lived in the core worlds, then many of your friends and family were forced to move to the Outer Rim, where they were likely to live in poverty amongst criminals and other non-friendly folk who are already out there. Those who stayed in the core worlds would have been subject to slander and mistreatment by the population en masse. They would have likely lost any social standing that they had before the Empire was created. And that's why a good chunk of the rebellion was consisted of non-humans, because they had more reason to rebel than almost anyone else. But what if you were human or near human? Well, no matter what race you were, the Empire was still a fascist dictatorship. No matter how you spin it, unless you were inside the machine, you probably had a little bit of a bad taste in your mouth. The first season of Andor actually gives us plenty of insight on this matter, so let's take a day trip down to Ferrix and see what they were like. It's worth noting that prior to the Andor series, the planet Ferrix had a run-in with the Empire and had a brief occupation, so the populace had first-hand experience with their antics. After the Empire left the first time, Marva mentions that the people of Ferrix did their best to keep the Empire off their planet. They kept their trade lanes open, they paid their dues, and they kept their heads down in the best attempt to continue living their lives in relative freedom. I think that having an Imperial force come in and do public hangings will do that to people. But, as we know, in the events of Andor, the Imperials are at their doorstep once again, and it doesn't take very long after the occupation for the residents to take up arms and actively rebel. Granted, the reason the Empire was there the first time was because of possible rebel activity, and they were met with violence as soon as they landed on Ferrix. And in no way is that an indication of what happened every time the Empire landed on a planet, but it wasn't uncommon for people to initially rebel against an occupation. But once a city or two has been razed to the ground and built up as a military base, people usually got the idea and kept their heads down. Later on, when Andor joins the rebellion for the heist, we get some awesome quotes that encompass the extent of the Empire's oppression. Karis Nemec has several of them, like, "The pace of repression outstrips our ability to understand it, and that is the real trick of the Imperial thought machine. It's easier to hide behind 40 atrocities than a single incident." And this is very telling of the Empire's entire thought process. If occupations are something that happen all the time, then people begin to normalize it, and it's just something that happens. And then suddenly you don't think twice when they do it to another planet. Another quote is, "Weapons are tools. Those that use them are, by extension, assets that we must use to our best advantage. The Empire has no moral boundaries. Why should we not take hold of every chance we can? Let them see how an insurgency adapts." And you have to take everything this guy says with a grain of salt because he is the heart of the rebellion, really. And of course, everything that comes out of his mouth is going to be anti-Empire. But we get to understand that the people who see through the Empire as just a form of government understand that the Empire has no boundaries, no morals, and they'll do anything they can to stay in power. On the opposite side of the spectrum, you have a great quote from Colonel Yularen to show how the Empire feels about the rebellion. "The criminals responsible for last night's atrocity on Aldhani think they've taken the Empire by surprise. We know better. We know the real shock will be when they discover how ready and eager we are to respond. To be prepared. To be here this morning knowing that the only question we need to answer is how tight to close our fist. This is why we plan. This is why we work so hard when we're at peace. This is why we recruit so carefully and demand so much." This gives us a lot of information on its own, even without looking into the bureau that we see in the show. The Empire is ready to crush any opposition at any given time, and that's how they gained so much power so quickly and kept the galaxy in a chokehold for over 20 years. Most people don't realize that they're being oppressed because the Empire has been so careful to make it look like they're playing for the greater good. Their propaganda is really outstanding, just like any fascist state, and it has to be that way to cover up their own atrocities. Aside from the obvious genocide, we see in Andor with the labor prisons where people are thrown in for indefinite periods over small offenses and forced to work or die, or the extreme torture methods that they come up with that leaves Bix traumatized. Not to mention public hangings over insurgents, or people being slaughtered over potentially harboring Jedi or other fugitives like we see in the Obi-Wan series. And that all leads back to our previous question. What if you were human or near human? Well, if you're a human in the core worlds, then your life probably went unchanged, or got better. You might have worked for the Empire in one way or another because they had billions of employees. Even if you weren't within the Empire, if you were human, then you would get social points and opportunities just for not being an alien. If you were in the core worlds, you were actively taken care of by the Empire. You probably just thought they were doing what was right, and any military action that you heard of would have been broken down to, they're just getting rid of the troublemakers who would undo the peace that we've achieved. However, if you weren't in the core worlds, your opinion would have likely been a little lesser. If you have had any sort of interaction with the Empire, then you likely had good reason to fear them and even dislike them. You may not like them, but you would almost certainly keep your head down and pay your dues so that you can continue living your life without any sort of imperial interference. It's worth noting that the Empire is a direct parallel to the Nazi regime, so you can think of it in the same terms almost exactly. If you were within the system, you were taken care of. If you weren't, then you were probably indentured in one way or another. So let's talk general population. The total universe has somewhere around 100 quadrillion sentient species. There's not really a good indication of the population disparity between the core, mid, and outer rim, but we know that Coruscant alone has a population in the trillions, and that the core worlds are typically the most densely populated in the galaxy. I think it's safe to assume that between all the core worlds, you can make up the majority of the galaxy's population in comparison to the mid and outer rim. And of the quadrillions in the universe, before the Battle of Yavin, the population of the Resistance was in the vast minority, probably counting only in the millions, and low millions at that. So with that knowledge, let's start summarizing. We know that if you were non-human, you would have no reason to like the Empire. We can safely assume that 99% of these folks would have been against them, but not necessarily actively rebelling. I'm saying 99% because I am sure there's the 1% of non-humans who were totally pro-Empire and thought that they were doing the right thing, for some reason, because there was always a fringe minority. If you were near human, you were probably okay with the Empire. At the very least, they didn't sell you into slavery or force you out of hearth and home, so it'd be fairly easy to take a relatively apathetic approach and say that your life was alright. They were taking care of you as much as they needed to. So I'd guess that probably 75 to 80% of near humans were probably pro-Empire, just out of sheer apathy. If you were human, then there wasn't much reason for you to rebel unless your system happened to be one of the ones stepped on by the Empire or you lived in the Outer Rim. I think it's safe to assume that most humans lived in the core worlds and were taken care of fairly generously. It would have been easy to turn a blind eye to all the atrocities committed because of how you were treated. Most humans probably supported the Empire or were at least comfortable enough that they didn't feel the need to rebel. Overall, thanks to the Imperial propaganda machine, most people were fairly complacent, if not compliant. If you kept your head down, lived your life, and didn't take any radical action, then you were probably doing all right. Non-humans and Jedi notwithstanding. And I think that about sums it up. The Empire was a massive, sprawling dictatorship, but the way that it came around to overturning the Republic was so clever and subtle that most people didn't bat an eye. That, coupled with their extreme attention to detail, would make sure that they had a good look in the public eye. Most people were living comfortably and didn't have any reason to necessarily dislike the Empire unless you were inside of politics during the rise of the Empire like Bail Organa. And we know how that ended up. On a whole, it seemed that most people tolerated the Empire for as long as it was around, and that if the rebellion didn't get someone like Luke Skywalker to come in, blow up the Death Star, and take down the Empire, then they might not have really been taken down in the end. But I would love to hear your thoughts on the matter. Do you think it's reasonable that the population en masse was so complacent with the government? Or do you think there should have been more cause for concern among the citizens, and do you think they should have gotten up and rebelled sooner? You can find us online at Lord to Death on your favorite social media or podcast websites, as well as on YouTube if you want to read along instead of just listening. I've been putting a lot of work into those videos lately, so I really hope that you do check them out. If you have any ideas, let us know and your question could become an episode. Until then, safe travels, remember to punch a fascist, and I'll talk to you next time. See ya.